It was the summer of 2011, and I had just turned 13. Looking back now, it almost feels like the last summer before the world changed. Social media hadn't swallowed everyone's attention yet. Kids still spent entire afternoons outside without checking a phone every few minutes. We rode bikes until sunset, invented games, got grass stains on our clothes, and came home only when someone yelled that dinner was ready. My birthday had been just a few days earlier. I remember it vividly because there was still half of an ice cream cake sitting in our freezer. Earlier that afternoon, my friends Kyle and Zuck had helped me finish the leftovers while we sat in the backyard laughing about nothing important. At 13, life felt unbelievably simple. None of us had any idea how quickly that feeling of safety could disappear. My parents were both at work, and my older sister was supposed to be out with friends. Before leaving, my parents reminded me of the one rule that mattered whenever I stayed home alone: don't leave the property. Having friends over was perfectly fine, but we weren't allowed to wander the neighborhood. We had to stay inside the house or in the backyard until someone came home. That wasn't much of a sacrifice. Our house sat in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Westchester, New York. Surrounded by homes that all looked similar from the street, but hid surprisingly large backyards behind them. Ours stretched farther than most, opening into a wide patch of grass bordered by fences and tall trees. It was the perfect place for baseball, soccer, or whatever ridiculous game we invented that day. Instead of playing video games, we decided to wrestle. Like every 13-year-old obsessed with WWE, we each picked our favorite wrestler and exaggerated every move. We shouted fake commentary, copied signature taunts, and dramatically threw each other onto the soft grass as if thousands of imaginary fans were cheering us on. The backyard itself had an unusual layout. Stepping out through the back door, you first reached a covered patio filled with outdoor furniture beneath a large awning. 2 concrete steps led down into the lawn, which started fairly narrow before expanding into a much wider area farther back. From almost anywhere in the yard, you could clearly see the rear windows of the second floor. That detail would become impossible to forget. We were halfway through another ridiculous wrestling match when something caught my attention. Without thinking, I glanced toward the upstairs windows. At first, I thought the bright afternoon sun was playing tricks on my eyes. The glass reflected so much light that it was difficult to see inside, but then I noticed it. Someone was standing perfectly still in my parents' bedroom window. The figure wasn't moving, it wasn't waving, it wasn't looking around. It was simply standing there, watching us. I immediately froze. For several seconds, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My parents weren't supposed to be home, neither was my sister. There should have been nobody upstairs. I yelled time out. Kyle and Zuck stopped wrestling and looked over at me. I pointed toward the bedroom window the instant I did. The figure stepped backward and disappeared. My friends turned too late. What? Kyle asked. There was someone in that window. Neither of them believed me at first. They assumed I was joking. I wasn't. A strange pressure settled into my chest. Without really explaining why, I told them I was just going inside to see if somebody had come home unexpectedly. I walked through the back door trying to convince myself that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe my parents had returned early. Maybe my sister had come home. Maybe I had only imagined it. The house greeted me with complete silence. No television, no footsteps, no voices. Only the faint humming of the air conditioner somewhere upstairs. I called my sister's name, nothing. Then I called for my mom, no answer, my dad. Still nothing. I stepped into the downstairs den and called again, this time louder. The silence stretched for another few seconds, then a floorboard creaked upstairs just once. Old houses make noises all the time, I knew that. But this wasn't random settling. It sounded exactly like someone shifting their weight. Every hair on my arm stood up. Someone was definitely upstairs. I hurried into the small office beside the den where our landline sat on the desk. I dialed my mother's cell phone. It rang, no answer. I called my father, the same result. I tried both numbers again, still nothing. I realized I didn't even know my sister's cell phone number by memory. That had never seemed important before. Now it suddenly felt like a terrible mistake. Trying to calm myself, I climbed to the main floor and looked through the front window. The driveway was empty. Neither of my parents' cars was there. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been upstairs didn't belong in the house. I slowly looked toward the staircase leading to the bedrooms. Sis. My own voice sounded strangely small, no response. Instead, footsteps this time much closer, slow, measured, almost cautious. Someone was moving just beyond the top of the stairs. I called my sister's name one last time, silence, then I looked upward. For one horrifying second I saw it, a bare foot. Only the front half was visible, sticking slightly out from behind the hallway wall. The skin looked dirty. The foot was much larger than my father's. It definitely wasn't my sister's. Whoever it belonged to was standing completely still, hiding just out of sight, watching me, waiting. I don't remember making a conscious decision. Every survival instinct simply took over, without running, without screaming. I slowly backed down the stairs. The second I reached the den, I sprinted toward the landline as fast as I possibly could. I nearly knocked over the chair, grabbing the phone before racing back outside. My friends immediately knew something was wrong. There really is someone in the house, I gasped. My hands were shaking so badly that I struggled to dial my parents again. Finally, my mother answered. She sounded irritated. She wanted to know why I had called so many times. The irritation vanished instantly after hearing the panic in my voice. There is someone upstairs. For a brief moment, she said nothing. Then she asked the question that still surprises me today. Why are you calling me instead of the police? She told me to hang up immediately and dial 911. As I reached for the phone again, Zuck suddenly pointed toward the second floor. Dude, I looked up. This time the figure stood inside my bedroom. Again, the afternoon glare hid every facial feature. All I could see was a dark human silhouette staring through my window. The figure remained there for perhaps 2 seconds. Then slowly stepped away from the glass, no panic, no rush. Almost as if whoever it was knew we couldn't do anything. That image still visits me sometimes. I called 911. Trying to explain everything while barely keeping my voice steady remains one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. The dispatcher stayed calm, asking simple questions while assuring me officers were already on their way. Those few minutes felt endless. Every upstairs window suddenly seemed alive. Every shadow made me wonder if the intruder was still watching us. Then we heard someone pounding on the backyard gate. Police. An officer entered with another right behind him. I pointed toward the house. He's upstairs. The officers disappeared inside with their weapons drawn. The silence that followed felt unbearable. Every second stretched into another minute, then came loud shouting, heavy footsteps, more yelling. Finally, the front door opened. The officers escorted a man outside in handcuffs. He looked nothing like I had imagined. His clothes were torn, he was barefoot. His eyes drifted aimlessly as though he barely understood where he was. He appeared intoxicated, unstable, and frighteningly unpredictable. He cursed nonstop at the officers, slurring nearly every word. Seeing him made one terrifying realization sink in. That man hadn't simply been hiding upstairs, he had been watching us. Watching 3 children play in the backyard. Watching me walk through the house. Watching me call out for my family. Had I walked all the way upstairs instead of stopping at the staircase? I don't even like thinking about what might have happened. After everything settled down, I walked through every room with one of the officers. Nearly every bedroom drawer had been opened, closets had been searched. Cabinets stood partially open. Oddly enough, nothing valuable appeared to be missing. It seemed as though he had either been interrupted before stealing anything, or had entered for reasons far more disturbing than simple burglary. The police believed he had simply found an unlocked door. No elaborate break-in, no smashed window, just one forgotten lock. It remains one of the most terrifying lessons I've ever learned. Sometimes real horror doesn't arrive with broken glass or loud alarms. Sometimes it quietly walks through an unlocked door, waits silently inside your home, and watches you long before you ever realize you are no longer alone. Years later, I experienced another unsettling weekend that reminded me just how quickly ordinary situations can become deeply unnerving. Last summer, my older brother Ben asked if I could stay at his house while he and his fiancée went away for the weekend. They had planned the trip months in advance and only needed someone they trusted to look after their chocolate Labrador, Bear. I had watched Bear many times before. He was friendly, obedient, and endlessly energetic. Without giving it much thought, I agreed. Ben lived about 25 minutes outside town in a quiet rural community where every house sat on several acres of land. The properties were separated by long driveways, open fields, and patches of woodland. Behind his house stretched 3 separate sections of forest, connected by winding trails that local residents used for hiking, jogging, and mountain biking. The woods weren't particularly large. They never struck me as dangerous during the day. Sunlight filtered through the branches. Birds filled the air with constant noise. And everything looked peaceful enough to belong on a postcard. Bear absolutely loved those trails. According to Ben, if Bear didn't get at least 2 walks a day, he'd become restless and spend hours pacing around the house. Friday passed without incident. I arrived shortly after Ben and his fiancée left, unpacked my overnight bag, fed Bear, and took him on a relaxed evening walk before settling in with a movie. Nothing felt unusual. If someone had told me then that the dog would notice something long before I ever did, I probably would have laughed. Saturday morning started just as quietly. After breakfast, I clipped Bear's leash onto his collar and headed toward the familiar trail shortly before noon. The weather was warm but comfortable beneath the thick canopy of leaves overhead. For the first 20 minutes, everything felt perfectly ordinary. Then Bear stopped, not gradually, not hesitantly, instantly. His entire body became rigid, his ears stood straight up, his tail lowered. Every muscle tightened as he stared into the trees off to our left. At first, I assumed he'd spotted a squirrel, or maybe a deer. The woods were full of wildlife. I gently tugged the leash. Normally, Bear would have followed immediately. This time, he didn't move an inch. He kept staring into the darkness between the trees, listening, not barking, not growling, simply listening. Nearly half a minute passed before he finally relaxed enough to continue walking. Even then, something had clearly changed. Every few steps, he stopped and looked back down the trail behind us. Again, and again, and again. It wasn't curiosity, it looked more like concern. The kind of alertness dogs show when they know something is nearby that humans haven't noticed yet. I laughed nervously and told him he was acting paranoid. The words sounded much less convincing after I heard them out loud. A little farther along the trail, Bear froze for the second time. This time he turned completely around and stared toward the path we had already walked. I followed his gaze. The trail behind us was empty, no hikers, no cyclists, no movement. Only rows of silent trees stretching into the distance. Yet Bear refused to believe we were alone. Eventually, I persuaded him to keep walking, and we completed the loop before returning to the house. The moment we stepped inside, Bear returned to his cheerful, playful self as though nothing had happened. At the time, I convinced myself there had been a simple explanation. Maybe he had smelled another animal. Maybe he had heard something too distant for me to notice. I didn't realize then that animals often sense danger long before people do. And by the time humans finally understand what the dog was trying to warn them about, it is sometimes already far too late. The rest of the afternoon passed without giving me a single reason to feel uneasy. Bear and I spent hours outside in the backyard. I tossed a worn tennis ball across the grass while he bounded after it with the endless enthusiasm that only a happy Labrador seems capable of having. Every time he returned the ball, his tail wagged so violently that his entire body seemed to move with it. If there had been anything unusual hiding around the property, neither of us showed any sign of noticing it. As the sun slowly slipped behind the trees, the air cooled and I headed back inside. After feeding Bear and making myself something simple for dinner, I settled onto Ben's oversized sectional in the living room. I decided to continue watching Game of Thrones, figuring it was the perfect way to spend a quiet Saturday night. The house itself was incredibly peaceful, too peaceful. Living out in the countryside meant there was no steady hum of traffic, no distant sirens, no neighbors walking past the windows, only silence. The kind of silence that feels comforting during the day, but strangely oppressive after dark. Bear curled up beside me on the couch and fell asleep almost immediately, occasionally twitching in his dreams. Every now and then I absent-mindedly scratched behind his ears without taking my eyes off the television. Outside, darkness swallowed everything beyond the windows. The backyard lights illuminated only a small section of grass near the deck, before surrendering to an endless wall of black woods. It was probably around 9:30 when the knock came. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, not loud, not frantic. Just enough to announce that someone was standing on the other side of the front door. The sound startled me so much that I instinctively muted the television. Every sound inside the house instantly disappeared. Only the ticking of the wall clock remained. For a few seconds, I simply stared toward the front hallway. Nobody should have been visiting. Ben hadn't mentioned expecting anyone. The nearest neighbor lived far enough away that people generally called before driving over. Yet someone was standing outside, waiting. I walked quietly toward the front door. Instead of opening it, I stayed several feet back. "Who's there?" I asked through the closed door. A man's voice answered almost immediately, "Is Tom home?" Hearing my own first name sent an unexpected chill through me. For one brief second, I wondered whether Ben had somehow forgotten to mention someone, then the voice continued, "I'm looking for Tom." He gave a last name that wasn't mine, not even close. I frowned. "I think you've got the wrong house," I replied. "Nobody by that name lives here." Silence followed, not awkward silence, not confused silence. The kind of silence where someone is thinking. Finally, the man answered in a calm, almost emotionless voice, "I don't think I do." Every instinct inside me tightened. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he said it. No confusion, no apology, no embarrassment. It sounded less like someone who had made a mistake, and more like someone testing my response. I cleared my throat. "You definitely have the wrong address." Another pause, longer this time. "I'd appreciate it if you'd leave." Nothing, no footsteps, no apology. No sound of someone walking back toward a vehicle, only complete silence. I remained frozen beside the door for nearly half a minute. The man never spoke again. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. Very carefully, I stepped toward the living room window overlooking the front porch. Using 2 fingers, I separated the blinds just enough to peek outside. The porch was empty. No one stood near the front door. No vehicle sat in the driveway, no flashlight, no movement, nothing. I checked through another window facing the front yard, still nothing. It was as if whoever had knocked had simply vanished. I told myself he must have walked away while I was standing there listening. It was the only explanation that made sense. Even so, I reached over and checked the deadbolt. Locked. I twisted it again anyway. Only after hearing the solid metallic click did I finally return to the couch. Bear had lifted his head during the knocking, lazily watching the hallway. Once everything became quiet again, he sighed and rested his head back on the cushion. For a while, I convinced myself I had overreacted. The television resumed. The familiar soundtrack filled the room. Gradually, my nerves settled. But somewhere in the back of my mind, that conversation refused to leave me. Around 11 o'clock, Bear suddenly stood up. He walked directly to the sliding glass door leading onto the back deck. Instead of barking, he let out a quiet, impatient whine. He needed one last trip outside before bed. I clipped the leash onto his collar and slid the glass door open. Cool night air immediately drifted inside. The backyard looked completely different than it had only a few hours earlier. The floodlights mounted along the house illuminated the deck, the stairs, and a portion of the lawn. Beyond that, darkness. The woods formed a solid black wall roughly 50 yards away. No moonlight reached beneath the dense canopy. The trees absorbed every trace of light. Bear stepped down the wooden stairs exactly as he always did. Then, he stopped. His entire body became rigid, his ears snapped forward. His tail lowered. I had seen this exact posture earlier on the hiking trail. Only this time something was different. He wasn't simply listening. A deep growl rumbled from somewhere inside his chest. Low, slow warning. The hairs along his back lifted one by one. My heartbeat immediately accelerated. "What is it, Bear?" He ignored me completely. His eyes remained locked on the woods. I followed his gaze. At first, nothing. The darkness appeared completely still, then movement. A human figure burst across the edge of the tree line, not walking, running. It crossed one small opening between the trees, before disappearing back into the shadows almost instantly. There was no mistaking what I had seen. It wasn't a deer, it wasn't a coyote, it was a person. Someone had been standing just inside the woods, watching the house. Before my brain could even process what was happening, Bear exploded forward with unbelievable force. The leash burned across my palm as it slipped free. Bear. He charged across the yard at full speed, barking louder than I had ever heard in my life. His bark wasn't playful, it wasn't excited. It was aggressive, protective, determined. He reached the tree line within seconds and disappeared into the darkness without slowing down. Every sensible decision would have been to stay where I was, go inside, lock every door, call the police. Instead, I chased him. The thought of losing my brother's dog completely overwhelmed every other instinct. I sprinted across the grass, yelling his name over and over. The moment I crossed beneath the trees, everything changed. The temperature seemed colder. The darkness became almost absolute. The thick canopy swallowed what little light reached from the backyard. Within seconds, the house behind me had nearly disappeared from view. Branches scraped against my shoulders. Dead leaves crunched beneath every step. Ahead of me, Bear continued barking somewhere deeper inside the woods. The sound echoed strangely between the trees, making it almost impossible to judge his exact location. I pushed farther in, then farther still. Soon I realized I couldn't actually see him anymore, only hear him. That realization finally forced me to slow down. Without a flashlight, the forest felt completely different. Every fallen branch resembled someone crouching. Every shadow looked like a person standing perfectly still. Every tree seemed to conceal another. I stopped running. Bear, only barking, answered me, then another sound, footsteps. At first I assumed Bear had circled back. But these weren't the quick, uneven sounds of a dog moving through leaves. These were slow, heavy, measured human footsteps. They came from somewhere off to my right, not ahead, not behind. Beside me, I froze. The footsteps stopped instantly. The silence that followed was unbearable. Even Bear had stopped barking for a moment. My breathing suddenly sounded deafening. I listened, nothing. Just the distant rustling of leaves shifting in the night breeze. Then Bear barked again, much farther ahead. For a split second I considered turning around, walking back to the house. Pretending none of this had happened, that was when I heard it, another set of footsteps, this time, behind me, not close enough to see. Close enough to know they were there. Whoever had been somewhere beside me was no longer beside me. They had quietly changed positions while I stood frozen in the darkness, and somehow, I had never heard them move. I spun around so quickly that I nearly lost my balance. Nothing, only darkness. The woods had transformed into a wall of solid black, swallowing every outline beyond a few feet. Moonlight barely reached the forest floor beneath the thick canopy, leaving countless shadows that seemed to shift whenever I moved my eyes. I strained to see something, anything, but there was nothing. Then, crunch, a single footstep. It came from somewhere off to my left. I snapped my head toward the sound. Again, nothing. A few seconds later, another step. This time farther to my right. Then another somewhere behind me. Each sound seemed to come from a different direction, never close enough to reveal whoever was making it. A horrible realization slowly settled into my mind. Whoever was out there wasn't wandering aimlessly, they were moving around me, keeping just beyond the limits of my vision. Every time I turned toward one sound, another came from somewhere else. It felt deliberate, calculated. Like someone who knew exactly how much noise to make without allowing themselves to be seen. The woods suddenly felt much larger than they had only minutes before. I tried convincing myself there had to be a rational explanation, maybe another hiker. Maybe someone searching for a lost dog. Maybe the darkness was distorting where the sounds came from, but deep down, none of those explanations fit. If someone had honestly been hiking through those woods at nearly 11 o'clock at night, they would have answered when I called out. Instead, whoever it was remained completely silent, only the footsteps continued, slow, patient, almost playful. My heartbeat pounded so violently I could hear it echoing inside my ears. I suddenly became aware of how vulnerable I really was. I didn't know these trails, not in daylight, certainly not at night. I had no flashlight. No weapons, no phone in my hand. No idea how far I had run from the house. And somewhere inside those trees was the same person I had watched sprint into the woods only moments earlier. Or perhaps not the same person at all. For the first time that night, another terrifying possibility entered my mind. What if there had never been only one person? I stood perfectly still, trying to control my breathing. The silence stretched. Then Bear barked again somewhere deeper ahead. His bark sounded different now, less aggressive, more frantic. As if he had cornered something. Or something had cornered him. Bear. I screamed his name with every ounce of strength I had. No response. Only another bark somewhere beyond the trees. Every instinct urged me to keep running after him. But another much stronger instinct finally took control. Leave now. I turned and sprinted back the way I had come. Branches whipped across my face. Twigs snapped beneath my shoes. Sharp limbs clawed at my arms as though the forest itself wanted to slow me down. Behind me, another footstep, then another. Whether someone was actually following me or whether panic was magnifying every sound, I still don't know. I never looked back. Looking back felt like the worst possible decision. Instead, I focused on one thing. The faint glow of Ben's backyard lights shining through the trees. Those lights became my lifeline. With every step they grew brighter until I finally burst out of the woods and stumbled into the open backyard. Only then did I stop running. Bent over with my hands on my knees, I fought to catch my breath while staring back toward the tree line. The darkness looked completely motionless. As though nothing had ever been inside it. As though the woods were mocking me, I shouted Bear's name again and again. My voice echoed across the yard before disappearing into the forest. Nothing answered. 30 seconds passed, then nearly a minute. Every second felt impossibly long. I began wondering if I had made the worst decision imaginable by turning back. Then, bark, closer this time, another bark. Branches rustled violently. A moment later, Bear exploded out of the woods at full speed. His paws barely touched the ground as he raced across the grass toward me. Relief washed over me so quickly my knees almost gave out. But the relief lasted only seconds. Bear didn't run toward the sliding glass door. Instead, he stopped halfway up the deck stairs. His entire body froze. He turned around and stared directly back into the woods. His ears stood straight up. His tail became rigid. Every muscle in his body locked into place. He wasn't barking anymore. He wasn't growling. He was simply watching. Watching something I couldn't see. I followed his line of sight. Nothing, only darkness. Yet Bear remained completely focused on one exact point between the trees. It looked less like curiosity and more like recognition. As though whatever had been inside those woods had finally stepped close enough for him to see again. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed his collar with both hands. He resisted, not aggressively, almost reluctantly. Like he wanted to continue standing guard. I pulled harder until he finally backed through the sliding door. The moment we were inside, I slammed the glass shut, locked it, checked the lock twice, then lowered the blinds. Only then did I realize my hands were shaking uncontrollably. For the rest of the night, the house felt completely different. Every ordinary sound carried new meaning, the refrigerator humming, wood settling. The air conditioning turning on. Each noise made me stop and listen. I walked from window to window checking every angle of the property, every exterior door, every lock, every curtain. I even turned off several lights inside so I could better see outside. Nothing, no movement, no flashlight, no silhouette. No evidence that anyone had ever been there. Several times I considered calling the police. But what exactly would I tell them? That I saw someone running into the woods, that my dog chased them. That I heard footsteps in the dark, without a description, without photographs, without proof. I doubted they would find much. So I stayed inside and waited. Bear never truly relaxed. He lay beside the couch, but every 15 or 20 minutes his head would suddenly rise. His ears would swivel toward another side of the house. Sometimes the backyard, sometimes the front. Sometimes toward a wall where there wasn't even a window. Each time he became perfectly still, listening. Whenever he did, I instinctively held my own breath. I listened as hard as I could, yet I never heard a thing. That almost made it worse. Dogs hear sounds long before humans ever do. If Bear was reacting, then perhaps there really was something outside. Something I simply couldn't detect. Sleep became impossible. The television continued playing, though I couldn't remember a single scene. Hours slipped by. Midnight, 1 o'clock, 2, 3. The digital clock beside the television eventually read 4:02 a.m. Only then did exhaustion finally overpower fear. I drifted into a shallow sleep with every light in the living room still turned on. The next morning, sunlight made everything seem almost ridiculous. The same woods that had terrified me now looked peaceful. Birds chirped overhead. Squirrels darted through the branches. The entire forest appeared harmless. For a moment, I questioned whether fear had exaggerated everything. Still, I couldn't ignore what had happened. After breakfast, I walked carefully toward the edge of the woods. This time I brought my phone and stayed well within sight of the backyard. I searched for footprints, broken branches, discarded clothing, a backpack. Anything that suggested another person had been there. I found absolutely nothing, no tracks, no disturbed leaves. No sign that anyone had entered or left the woods. It was as though the previous night had erased itself. Late that afternoon, Ben and his fiancée finally returned home. The moment they walked inside, I told them everything. The strange behavior on the hiking trail. The mysterious man knocking on the front door, asking for someone who didn't live there. The runner disappearing into the woods, Bear chasing after him. The footsteps surrounding me beneath the trees. The restless night that followed. Ben listened without interrupting. When I finished, he didn't laugh, he didn't question my story. Instead, he became unusually quiet. After several long seconds, he finally spoke. Something similar happened to me. Those words sent another chill through my body. He explained that nearly a year earlier, Bear had behaved almost exactly the same way one evening. The dog had frozen in the backyard, stared toward the woods, then started barking uncontrollably. Ben had looked up just in time to catch the briefest glimpse of someone slipping between the trees. He searched the area afterward but never found anyone. Eventually nothing else happened, life returned to normal, months passed. He convinced himself it had probably been a trespasser or a hunter cutting through the property, until I told him my story. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Different nights, different years, the same woods, the same dog. The same feeling of being watched. I packed my things later that evening and drove home, but the questions stayed with me far longer than the fear itself. Who had been standing outside the house that night? Why had they remained hidden instead of leaving? Had they been watching the property before knocking? Or had someone else been waiting inside those woods, while the man at the front door distracted whoever answered? Those questions have never been answered. Ben and his fiancée still live there today. Thankfully, nothing like that has happened again, at least. Nothing they've told me about. Even now, whenever I visit after sunset and Bear wanders into the backyard, I find myself doing the exact same thing every single time. I don't watch the dog, I watch the woods. Because once you've spent a single night believing that unseen eyes were following every move you made from the darkness, you never look at a quiet tree line the same way again. My name is Dave and I'm 35 years old. Compared to most people I know, my family is surprisingly small. I have only 2 brothers, Pete and Jim, no cousins, no huge family reunions. Just the 3 of us, our parents, and the families we've built ourselves. Ironically, while many people today wait until their late 20s or 30s to have children, all 3 of us became fathers much younger. Maybe it was because we wanted to build the large family we never had growing up. Between the 3 of us, there are now 6 children ranging from toddlers to 10 years old. Family gatherings are loud, chaotic, and usually centered around one thing: barbecues. The story I'm about to tell happened only recently, during Memorial Day weekend in May of 2026. Nancy, my wife, and I volunteered to host everyone at our house. Our backyard was easily the biggest. We had a swimming pool, a covered patio, a large grilling area, and enough open lawn for all the kids to spend hours running around without getting in anyone's way. From the deck, the property looked almost perfect, almost. Because beyond the neatly trimmed grass stood a familiar sight, another line of woods, tall, silent. Dense enough that once the afternoon sunlight faded, they became little more than a wall of darkness stretching behind our home. Looking back now, I can't help thinking how perfectly ordinary horror likes to begin, not in abandoned buildings, not in haunted cemeteries, but in comfortable backyards where children laugh, burgers sizzle on the grill, and everyone believes nothing bad could possibly happen. Until someone or something quietly steps out from the trees. Everyone began arriving just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. For the first several hours, the day unfolded exactly the way every Memorial Day gathering at our house always had. The backyard was full of life. The grill smoked steadily beneath the covered patio, while burgers and ribs filled the air with that unmistakable smell of summer. Cold drinks disappeared almost as quickly as they came out of the cooler. My brothers Pete and Jim stood around the grill arguing about football and laughing over stories we'd all heard 100 times before. Our parents relaxed in lawn chairs beneath the shade, while Nancy floated lazily in the pool with the kids. The children never seemed to stop moving. 1 minute they were splashing in the water. The next they were chasing each other across the wide stretch of grass behind the patio. Their laughter echoed through the yard from afternoon until evening, blending with the distant hum of insects and birds hidden somewhere in the trees beyond the property. Everything about the day felt ordinary, comfortable, safe. Looking back now, I think that's why what happened later disturbed us so deeply. Real fear almost never announces itself. It quietly slips into places where you feel the safest. As the afternoon faded into evening, the sky turned orange before slowly giving way to deep shades of blue. We lit the backyard's string lights. Someone started a small fire in the stone fire pit. The younger kids wrapped themselves in towels after swimming, while the adults gathered around with drinks and dessert. Nancy brought out bowls of homemade ice cream along with brownies and apple pie. It was one of those rare evenings where everyone seemed genuinely relaxed. No one was checking the time. No one was in a hurry to leave. Then it happened. A scream exploded from the woods behind our property. Not loud because it was close. Loud because whoever made it sounded utterly consumed by terror. The sound ripped through the night so violently that every conversation stopped in the middle of a sentence. Even the insects seemed to go silent. For several seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Every face turned toward the dark tree line. The children instinctively gathered closer to the adults without anyone telling them to. I don't think any of us were breathing. The scream lasted only a few seconds. But those few seconds seemed impossibly long. When the silence finally returned, it somehow felt even worse. It was Jim who finally broke it. Was that a fox? His voice lacked conviction. He sounded like he wanted someone to reassure him. I slowly shook my head. No. I had lived in Jasper long enough to know the sounds wildlife made. Foxes can produce terrifying screams. Bobcats can sound eerily human. Coyotes often make noises that unsettle people unfamiliar with them. But this wasn't any animal I had ever heard. There was pain in it, panic, desperation. It sounded unmistakably human. No one argued. Without saying anything, I reached over and turned off the music that had been quietly playing from the outdoor speakers. The sudden silence transformed the atmosphere. Moments earlier, the backyard had felt warm and welcoming. Now every shadow seemed darker, every tree looked taller. Every gap between the trunks appeared capable of hiding someone. The children noticed the change immediately. Even the younger ones stopped laughing. One of my daughters quietly asked whether somebody was hurt. I didn't know how to answer. Trying to calm everyone, Pete suggested it could simply be teenagers messing around. It was Memorial Day weekend after all. Kids sometimes wandered the woods, people played pranks. Someone could easily have been trying to scare homeowners. His explanation made sense, at least, until we heard it again. The second scream was somehow worse, longer, more desperate. It echoed through the trees before fading into complete silence. Nancy immediately stood up. Inside, she told the children. There wasn't a trace of hesitation in her voice. Nobody argued. Within seconds, the women gathered the kids and hurried them into the house. Only Pete, Jim, and I remained outside. None of us spoke. We simply walked toward the edge of the yard until we reached the point where the neatly cut grass ended and the woods began. Standing there felt strangely unnatural. The darkness beneath the trees seemed almost solid. Our flashlights were still inside. None of us had thought to grab them. We simply stood there listening. 5 minutes passed. Nothing, no voices, no movement, no footsteps, no third scream. Finally, I stepped a little closer and shouted into the woods, "Does somebody need help?" My own voice sounded unnaturally loud. The words echoed through the trees before disappearing into the darkness. No answer came back. I waited, called again, still nothing. The silence that followed somehow felt more unsettling than the screams themselves. Because now it felt as though something had heard us, and deliberately chosen not to respond. Eventually we walked back toward the house. None of us admitted it aloud, but I think we were all relieved to leave the tree line behind. The celebration never recovered after that. The music stayed off. Nobody wanted dessert anymore. The fire pit slowly burned itself down, while conversations became shorter and quieter. Every few minutes someone would glance toward the woods, without even realizing they were doing it. Eventually we agreed to move everything inside. The children watched cartoons, while the adults tried to continue talking as though nothing unusual had happened. For a while the screams dominated every conversation. We debated every possible explanation. An injured hiker, teenagers pulling a prank, someone recording sounds, wildlife, every theory felt possible. None felt convincing. As the hours passed, we gradually stopped talking about it altogether. People laughed again. Someone started another card game. Little by little the fear seemed to fade, or perhaps, we simply wanted it to. By around 10 o'clock, everyone began saying their goodbyes. My parents were the first to leave. Pete and Jim packed their children into their cars shortly afterward. Within half an hour, the driveway was empty again. The silence returned almost immediately. Nancy and I cleaned up what we could before deciding the rest could wait until morning. The kids had already fallen asleep upstairs, completely exhausted from swimming all day. We checked on each of them, turned off the downstairs lights, locked the doors, and finally climbed into bed ourselves. I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember how physically exhausted I felt. Then, the doorbell rang. The sound exploded through the quiet house. Nancy and I both sat upright instantly, our eyes met in the darkness. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally she whispered, "Who could that possibly be?" I checked the clock, far too late for visitors. Trying to sound calmer than I felt, I shrugged. Maybe Pete forgot something. Even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I climbed out of bed and quietly walked downstairs. Every creak of the staircase suddenly sounded unusually loud. I reached the front door but kept every lock firmly in place. "Who's there?" A man's voice answered immediately. "Hey, can you open up? It's important." There was something odd about his tone, not frightened, not rushed, just flat, almost rehearsed. I stayed exactly where I was. "Who are you?" A short pause. "I'm your neighbor from down the road." That answer only made me more suspicious. Most neighbors introduce themselves by name. They don't describe themselves vaguely. "Which neighbor?" Another pause. "My name's Jack." I frowned. We had lived there long enough that I knew nearly everyone nearby. There wasn't a Jack. At least not one I had ever met, so I asked another question. "What's your address?" Silence, complete silence. I waited. Nothing. I asked again. Still nothing. Then, soft footsteps crossed the wooden porch. They moved slowly down the front steps. A few seconds later, nothing. Whoever had been standing outside was gone, without another word. Without ever answering the simplest question. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute. Yet something about it disturbed me more than if the person had simply run away. It felt less like someone seeking help, and more like someone trying to get me to unlock the door. I immediately began checking every entrance. Front door, back door, sliding glass door, every first-floor window, garage entrance. Everything remained locked. Still, I checked each one twice. When I returned upstairs, Nancy was already standing in the hallway outside the children's bedrooms. She had gone to make sure they were all still asleep. After I explained what had happened, the color drained from her face. She tried convincing herself that maybe it really had been a neighbor. Maybe someone had car trouble, maybe someone needed a phone. But neither of us truly believed it. If someone genuinely needed help, why leave the moment they were asked a simple question? Eventually I managed to calm her enough that we returned to bed. Neither of us slept well. Every little sound inside the house seemed amplified. The air conditioner switching on, the refrigerator downstairs. The wind brushing against the siding, hours seemed to pass. At some point, exhaustion finally pulled me into a light sleep. Then Nancy grabbed my shoulder so hard it nearly threw me out of bed. I opened my eyes to find her staring toward the bedroom door. She wasn't speaking, she was listening. Finally, almost too quietly to hear, she whispered, "I think someone just closed the garage." I stared at her still half asleep. I heard it, her voice shook, the garage door. Unlike most houses, our garage door wasn't automatic. The motor had broken years earlier, and I had never gotten around to replacing it. Every single time someone opened or closed it, the heavy metal door scraped loudly along its tracks. It produced a slow, unmistakable grinding sound that echoed through the entire house. There was no way to mistake it for anything else, which meant only one thing: someone had just moved it. And neither of us had gone downstairs. If what Nancy had heard was real, then I had made a mistake that could have cost my family everything. The realization struck me so suddenly that it almost took my breath away. The garage. When everyone left earlier that night, we had been exhausted. We cleaned up in a hurry, checked the doors, checked on the kids, and stumbled upstairs to bed. Had I actually locked the garage? I couldn't remember. That uncertainty terrified me more than anything else. Because if the garage door hadn't been secured, someone could already be inside the house. My heartbeat instantly became so loud I could hear it in my ears. Without saying another word, I reached into the bedside drawer and pulled out the small .22 pistol I kept for emergencies. It wasn't something I ever expected to use. In all the years I'd owned it, it had never left that drawer except for cleaning or target practice. Tonight was different. Nancy immediately grabbed my arm. "Don't go." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. There was genuine fear in her eyes, not fear for herself. Fear that if I walked downstairs I might not come back. "I have to," I whispered. "If someone's in this house." I couldn't finish the sentence. The children were asleep only a few rooms away. Waiting upstairs wasn't an option. Every instinct told me to protect them before whoever might be downstairs had a chance to move. I stepped into the hallway and quietly closed the bedroom door behind me. The entire second floor was silent. No voices, no footsteps, no sounds from below. Only the faint pounding of my own heartbeat. I began descending the staircase one slow step at a time. Every wooden stair seemed determined to betray me with a quiet creak. Halfway down I stopped and listened. Nothing. Not even the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. The silence felt unnatural. Like the entire house was holding its breath. At the bottom of the stairs, I stood perfectly still for several long seconds. The hallway leading toward the garage stretched away into darkness. At the very end stood the interior garage door, closed, exactly as I had left it. I moved toward it one careful step at a time. The pistol felt unusually heavy in my hands. My palms had become slick with sweat. When I finally reached the door, I carefully tested the handle. Locked. I stared at it in confusion. If the door was still locked, then Nancy hadn't imagined the sound, which meant only one thing. Whoever had entered the garage hadn't entered the house. They were still trapped on the other side of that door. The realization sent a wave of cold through my entire body. For several seconds I simply stood there, unable to decide what to do. Call 911 first, wake the neighbors, wait. Every option felt too slow. Instead, I leaned forward and pressed my ear gently against the door. I listened. Nothing, no breathing, no footsteps, no movement. The silence was so complete that it almost convinced me the garage was empty. Almost. Very carefully, I unlocked the deadbolts. The metallic click sounded impossibly loud. I froze, still nothing. My hand wrapped around the doorknobs. I realized then that I was hesitating, not because I was unsure. Because every instinct inside me was screaming not to open that door. Whatever waited on the other side would no longer be hidden the moment I turned the handle. I counted silently. 1, 2, 3, I threw the door open. The pistol came up instinctively. The garage remained almost completely dark. I deliberately avoided turning on the overhead lights. If someone was hiding inside, I didn't want to blind myself. Only one tiny source of illumination existed. A faint red charging light glowed from a battery charger sitting on the workbench in the far corner. It barely produced enough light to separate shapes from darkness. At first I saw nothing, then my eyes adjusted. Something occupied the corner, a figure. Completely black against the darkness, standing perfectly still. For a brief moment my brain refused to accept what I was looking at, then I noticed it. The silhouette was moving, not walking. Not shifting naturally, swaying slowly back and forth almost rhythmically. Like someone standing in complete silence while gently rocking from heel to toe. The movement felt profoundly unnatural. Every horror story I had ever heard flashed through my mind at once. The image made my stomach twist, my mouth went completely dry. I forced myself to speak. I've got a gun. My voice cracked despite every attempt to sound confident. I've called the police. That last part wasn't true, not yet. But I hoped whoever stood in that darkness believed it. The figure stopped swaying. For one terrifying second, everything froze. Then the silhouette moved, fast, far faster than I expected. Instead of rushing toward me, it lunged toward the garage door. Before I could even react, the heavy garage door suddenly lifted several feet from the ground. Whoever it was had already unlocked it. The person ducked beneath the rising door with astonishing speed. All I caught was a dark human outline disappearing into the night. No face, no clothing, no distinguishing features. Only a shadow fleeing into darkness. A second later the heavy garage door crashed back onto the concrete floor with an echo that shook the entire house. Silence returned instantly. For several seconds I remained exactly where I stood. Still aiming into an empty garage. Still expecting the figure to reappear, it never did. Only then did I finally reach for the light switch. Bright fluorescent lights flooded the room. Every corner became visible. The garage was empty, completely empty. Tools remained exactly where they belonged. Shelves stood undisturbed. Nothing appeared stolen. Yet someone had undeniably been standing only a few yards away moments earlier. I hurried across the garage and forced the heavy door completely shut before engaging every lock I could. Only after checking them repeatedly did I finally lower the pistol. The entire encounter couldn't have lasted more than 45 seconds. Yet it felt as though an entire hour had passed. Adrenaline distorted every moment. Back inside, Nancy met me halfway down the hallway. One look at my face was enough. She didn't need to ask whether someone had really been there, she already knew. I immediately called the sheriff's office. This time there was no hesitation. I reported everything from the beginning. The screams echoing through the woods earlier that evening. The mysterious stranger who had tried convincing me to open the front door. The strange silence after I questioned him. Nancy hearing the garage door, the shadow inside the garage, the escape into the darkness. Deputies arrived surprisingly quickly. By then neither Nancy nor I had any intention of going back to sleep. The children remained asleep upstairs, thankfully unaware that a stranger had been only a few walls away while they slept. I walked the deputies through every detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed. They searched the garage, the backyard, the tree line behind the property, the front yard, the neighboring lots. Flashlights swept through the woods for nearly half an hour. Nothing, no footprints, no discarded clothing, no broken tools, no signs of forced entry. It was as though the person had dissolved into the night. One deputy quietly suggested the screams from earlier might have been unrelated. Another admitted he couldn't say for certain. They encouraged us to document everything, keep every entrance locked, install additional cameras, and call immediately if anything unusual happened again. They were professional, calm, reassuring. Yet even they couldn't offer an explanation that truly made sense. When they finally left, dawn was only a few hours away. Neither Nancy nor I slept again that night. For weeks afterward, every unexpected sound jolted us awake. Every creak of the house made us stop and listen. Every dog barking somewhere in the neighborhood drew our attention toward the windows. It's been just over a month now, yet the memory hasn't faded. Fear has a strange way of lingering, not as constant panic, but as quiet vigilance. You begin checking locks twice instead of once. You hesitate before turning off the last light downstairs. You pause before looking through a window at night, because part of you wonders whether someone might already be standing on the other side looking. Back, I've thought about that night countless times. I believe the stranger at the front door and the person hiding in the garage were almost certainly the same individual. The timing fits too perfectly. The visit to the front door may have been nothing more than an attempt to see whether anyone was awake, or to lure me outside while someone else moved around the property, but the screams. Those remain the most disturbing part of the entire experience. Maybe they were unrelated. Maybe they came from someone else somewhere deep in those woods. Or maybe they were connected to everything that happened afterward. If that's true, then whoever came onto my property that night wasn't simply looking for an unlocked garage. They had been out there long before they ever knocked on my door. And that thought is the one that still keeps me awake.